That leads us to a cultural examination of technology and use of such things as video. And what we see is that throughout the history of the church, there have been ongoing cultural adaptations and technological adaptations so that people could be best served, so that Jesus could be most widely loved, known, and worshiped as God. Amazingly enough, the average person who does attend church sits in a chair or a pew, but for the first more than 1,000 years of the church's history, there was no seating. Benches weren't even introduced in churches until the 13th century, pews as we know them in the 14th century, and in the 15th century, pews became popular and began being added to the architecting of churches. Now, if you just think about that, that was an enormous adjustment that for the first more than 1,000 years of the church's history, people stood up for an entire service. And invariably and undoubtedly, as the seating was added, I'm sure there were people who complained, saying, we've never done it this way. This is all new. This is compromise. I'm sure there were a few neatnicks and nitpicks who said, we're being lazy. If we really love Jesus, we'll stand up for 2 hours and get yelled at. But invariably, these adaptations allowed more people to worship Jesus, more people to meet Jesus. In roughly 1361, the first pipe organ was permanently installed in a building, and that allowed there to be a transformation in worship. Eventually, the churches realized that the organ that was down at the local pub was very popular, and people would gather to sing bar tunes. And so, in a missiological and cultural adaptation, the church took the organ and brought it into the church and rewrote some of the hymns and melodies of bar tunes, and that's how we get some of our very popular modern-day hymns. But again, that too was very controversial because it was taking something out of the culture and bringing it into the church. Well, then in 1436, our Christian brother Johann Gutenberg invented something called the printing press, and that changed everything. Up until that point, if you wanted a copy of the Bible or another Christian book, you had to pay for a literally handwritten copy. It was very expensive, very time-consuming. As a result, it was very difficult to obtain Christian literature and your own personal copy of the Bible. But in the invention of the printing press, Gutenberg enabled books to be written, and one of the first books that he published was the Bible. Well, that absolutely has transformed Christianity. It helped to undergird much of the Protestant Reformation where Christians could read the Bible for themselves. It has helped to undergird Christianity's sense as the publishing industry enables Christians to inexpensively obtain good Christian books and theology and doctrine and such, and to read, and in their reading to have their mind renewed and to grow in their relationship with Jesus. And today, there would be very few of us who would argue that books are a bad thing and that the invention of the printing press, which led to the change of some Christian lifestyle issues, was a bad thing. It was a blessing that we redeem. And in this, when it comes to issues of technology, there are aspects that we must reject. There are aspects that we must receive, and there are aspects which we must redeem. Something like the printing press could be used to honor or dishonor God depending upon what is published. But in this, we see redemption. We see the redemption of the printing press. We see the redemption of the organ. Furthermore, in the late 1800s, concert halls began to be constructed whereby people could come to hear lectures and preaching and singing and music, and it was built in such a way that without modern-day loudspeakers, electricity, and amplification, larger crowds could benefit. That was a technological adaptation from culture that the church used. As well, in the 1800s, the use of electricity became more widely available. This led to such things as central heating and lighting and air conditioning, again, allowing more crowds to gather together, for them to meet in the evenings. It opens up new times and opportunities for worship. In 1924, the modern version of the loudspeaker was constructed, and in 1958, the first modern version of a boxed loudspeaker was invented. You think about it today, the average person goes to church and they have speakers and no one thinks anything of it, but since 1958 backward, that was completely impossible. That means only for a few generations has it even been possible in the history of the Christian faith for us to benefit from such things as loudspeakers. Now, if you contrast the use of loudspeakers and sound equipment with what happened prior to the invention of those things, it is a markedly different world. I'll give you one historical example. One of the great Reformed evangelists was a man named George Whitefield. And he, because there weren't yet amplification opportunities, loudspeakers, and such, he would go literally into the countryside and he would preach open-air sermons across the nation to large crowds. And he would have to scream at the top of his lungs, and people would need to pack in very tightly to reduce the distance from his unamplified voice. The result was that he preached somewhere in the neighborhood of 18,000 sermons. He preached live to 10 million people, and 150 churches were planted. The numbers aren't exact, but most estimates tell us that the largest crowd he ever preached to in open air with no amplification was 30,000 people. Now, the difficulty was that hardly anyone else in the history of the world could preach to those kind of crowds without amplification. And secondly, if you read the biographies of Whitefield, he would so strain and destroy his vocal cords that it was not uncommon after preaching that he literally would be spitting up blood from his throat. You compare how he had to struggle and suffer to a man like Billy Graham, one of my personal heroes. Billy Graham benefited from large meeting locations that, because of electricity, had such things as lighting, so you could meet in the evening, and heating and air conditioning. People could sit to hear the preaching of a message because the amplification of the sound system enabled that. Billy Graham preached live to over 210 million people in 185 countries. In addition to that, he preaches to this very day on television to multitudes, sometimes replaying past crusades. And because of technology, the work of Billy Graham will continue indefinitely. He could be made available on the radio. He could be made available on the internet. He could be made available on the television, even long after he should pass from this earth. Other adaptations that have really transformed how Christians deliver the gospel include radio. In 1895, the first radio signal was sent. In 1902, the first telegraph was sent across the English Channel, and insofar as I'm able to uncover in my research, only one letter of the alphabet was sent, that being the S. And in the early 1900s, the human voice began to be transmitted via radio airwaves. And again, in the history of the church, the use of radio is a very new adaptation. But it has benefited the church and the gospel of Jesus Christ because now someone need not be physically present to hear the preaching and teaching of God's Word. And the radio airwaves are filled with radio preachers, talk radio show hosts, all seeking to, as much as possible, do what Paul commanded in 1 Corinthians 9, to by all means, to use all methods to reach as many people as we possibly can.